Hello and welcome to our first video of week 7. This week we are discussing in our first topic spirituality in the workplace. And I wanted to do this one face to face with you. Instead of putting up slides and PowerPoints as I've been working on the past few weeks and incorporating more video techniques, I feel like this one really is more appropriate in sort of this looking into the camera blog style format. And the reason is because of the way people discuss spirituality. It can often feel a bit offensive if you're someone who isn't spiritual. It can feel a little bit uncomfortable, even if you are someone spiritual. It's very hard to know in the workplace and in life in general when it's okay to inject spirituality into the workplace. Now, I personally am very lucky. If I really want to use spiritual language, maybe even blessed, to work in healthcare, an industry which has a spiritual component. Patients often rely on prayer, meditation, or other techniques that are spiritual to help them in the recovery process. And many practitioners encourage this, right? We know that people who pray, people who meditate, people who engage in spiritual reflection while sick tend to recover faster than those who don't. We also find that in end of life care and palliative care, these people often are more relaxed, more serene, and have an easier time passing from the state of life into the state of death. And you could argue this is meaningful or not meaningful. I'm not here to get into that. What I would do, though, is break down a very good theoretical framework in which to address these issues. And that is in this framework, right? We see that we have four types of individual. We have the Gnostic theist, agnostic theist, Gnostic atheist, and the agnostic atheist. So, what are each of these and how should we use them, right? Well, a Gnostic theist is someone who believes there's a God. That's the word theist, it has to do with belief, and thinks that they can prove that they can know there's a God. This word gnosis in Greek, meaning knowledge, right? So a great example of this would be Thomas Aquinas. Right, St. Thomas Aquinas gives 5 proofs for God that he thinks are airtight, that he believes demonstrate that God must exist. And this knowledge leads him to sort of frame everything, including leadership and ethics in his day, in terms of that structure. He thinks of something like Christ as the head of the church, as a and he believes that he knows this, right? Not only does he believe it to be true, he thinks he can show it to be true with rational argumentation. And this opinion is usually not espoused by many people nowadays. Most people admit that they believe there's a God, or they believe in a spiritual force or a spiritual entity, and they believe that it's good to direct our goals in that direction. However, very few people would say that they know this to be the case with the kind of certainty that I know 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? And that makes sense. Most people nowadays see science, they see progress in the human condition. They're less likely to live in what some people call an enchanted world, right? One where knowing what's beyond the horizon is kind of impossible. And so I think people nowadays don't tend to favor this view. However, if you were to incorporate this into a leadership style or into a workplace theory, having this sort of certainty is sort of like last week having a charismatic leader. You're going to need to force people to conform to this opinion. If you have knowledge about a subject, justified true belief, knowledge, it is unacceptable to have other people not deign to that knowledge. It's impossible. If you truly know something is the case, and it is irrefutable, people who don't come on board are ignorant. There is nothing else, and that kind of cultish, sycophantism is generally not going to be healthy in the workplace. What may be healthy in the workplace is our next one, agnostic theism, right? So agnostic theism is exactly what it sounds like. Agnostic, I don't know, I don't have gnosis, but I have belief in the spiritual, right? And that makes sense, right? A great example of this is St. Ignatius of Loyola in his spiritual exercises. He is a person who focuses more on the interior life and on how his interior life compels him to behave towards other persons. He has this notion of what's called cura personalis in Latin. In English, we say care for the individual person, care for the whole person, right? And he believes that you have to take care of someone's body when they're sick. You have to feed them, you have to clothe them, you have to give them the means as an act of justice to be able to do it themselves. It's great to give a man a fish, it's better to teach him to fish, right? That would be Ignatian spirituality. And that sort of spirituality is probably the one you're most likely to want to encounter in the workplace today. There may be some emphasis on prayer or on meditation or on personal reflection in the workplace. And that sort of spiritual attitude can definitely lead to better outcomes, right? That orientation, that finding meaning in work, that building upon your current attitudes to create a more just or a more successful company, one that undergirds its institution with those sorts of spiritual values that Ignatius emphasizes, is a very, very powerful tool to create institutional change. This is more like the servant leadership model, right? In fact, Ignatius is a Christian. He's the founder of the Jesuit order. And the Jesuits are an incredibly effective organization in terms of what they can accomplish. They organize themselves like an army. And the reason they do that is Ignatius himself was a soldier. He's a soldier for Christ, as he would call it. And he took his men and sent them out to do acts of mercy, that is, feeding the hungry, helping the sick. But he also instructed them to get people off of charity. Acts of charity are good in the short term. When you're hungry, you need food today. But it's no good to give you food today if tomorrow you need the food again. It's better to help you develop yourself. And taking that sort of approach towards care of a patient, care of a coworker, care of an employee, a care of any person in your life is a really, really powerful tool to accomplish goals. And it's that servant leadership model that we've discussed before. Moving on from there, we're going to drop down into the atheist side of things. So our first one would be gnostic atheism. That is, there is no God, and I know this. That is a very, very powerful and difficult argument to make, right? Typically, when I say I believe something and I have no evidence for it, we might call that faith, right? This is saying that faith of any kind is irrational. Someone who does this is a very controversial philosopher. His name is Ludwig Feuerbach. And Feuerbach, in his writings, often talks about how he can criticize God or he can criticize spiritual people. He can criticize faith because he says faith is just believing something that you don't have any proof for. Someone who's in this category is almost as sycophantic as a Thomas Aquinas character, just in the opposite direction, claiming there is no value to spirituality. It's just a waste of time. It's a way of maybe what Freud would call wish fulfillment, right? As a way to sort of protect one's libido, one's life energy against their thanatos, their death instinct. It's just the same thing as the Gnostic theist, just in the opposite direction. Again, it would require some amount of charisma, it would require some amount of forced conversion. Leaders who have approached this in the past, like Mao Zedong, have had very bad outcomes. It's very, very hard to strip away spiritual things from people, to strip away faith, and to claim that you're doing this because you know it's good for them. It's almost a sort of paternalism. It also has a little bit more destructive end. The more destructive part of this is that if you consider people to be worth something, the way Marx would frame it in terms of praxis, the ability to create or to do work or to accomplish, then those who can't do this inherently don't have much value. And that's a dangerous place to be. Most of us would consider things like euthanizing the mentally handicapped to be immoral. But if you think about it from a Gnostic atheist perspective, this would be a good thing potentially, right? Um, Again, I don't want to say that anyone who's a Gnostic atheist is a bad person. This is a really, really extreme reading of things. Likewise, if you were an agnostic, I'm sorry, rather a Gnostic theist, you might justify burning people at the stake if they won't, join your team. Equally evil, right? But this Gnostic atheist character, this complete stripping away of the spiritual, is a type of paternalism. It's a type of argument that goes something like, I know best. Listen to me. The final category, probably the better, the more common form of an atheist or non-spiritual approach to life and leadership would be the agnostic atheist, someone who believes there's no God but doesn't claim to know this information. Great example, Matt Dillahunty. Matt Dillahunty is a modern atheist, often debates creationists and other Christian or Jewish or Muslim leaders. Often attempts to give some sort of polemics about keeping prayer out of schools or keeping the workplace secular. And in his case, it makes sense. What he's looking to do is reduce friction. We claim to live in a secular society. We claim that workplaces should also reflect our secular values that do not hang upon, God or a spiritual force to compel us to engage with them, but rather a rational force. So things like life, liberty, property, justice, mercy, those things can be discerned within the mind. It is not necessary to bring prayer or to bring Jesus or to bring Allah or Vishnu or anyone else into the equation. These are things that can be rationally discerned inside of one's head. You can take philosophy classes, you can take theology, you can take the class we're taking now, principled leadership, ethics, right? You can learn these things without needing to pray about them. You can learn these things without needing to incorporate a spiritual element. These are all rationally discernible or emotionally instructable, which kind of sounds like faith, but he would argue that instructing people emotionally is just the way of getting your foot in the door. You build an emotional attachment, something that people can feel, and then you give them a rational basis to go up this ladder. And so, in his case, he would say that he's not manipulating people; he's more using reasoning to get them to adopt the values that are necessary. So, if we think of an agnostic theist, like as we discussed Ignatius of Loyola, you can have the same sort of outcome with Matt Dillahunty, but your aim is completely different, right? You're getting to the same place, but you're aiming at two different things. In the first case, you're using a spiritual force to compel your followers to go out and do things. You're asking that there's a recognition of a higher power or a higher source of authority than the individual or even the corporate leader that directs and creates fulfillment within the individuals who are involved with it. And on the other hand, you're saying, no, what we're looking at is making people feel good, giving people some sort of positive emotional response. There is no God element or prayer element or meditation element that needs to be brought into that. We can begin with making people want to feel good about their decisions or understanding that the way they feel can affect the way other people feel. And then we can start with that emotional place and build up a rational basis for it. Think of it sort of like as a scaffolding. The emotions are a scaffolding around a tower of logic. And that's the way someone like Dillahunty might present his case for this sort of leadership. At the end of the day, though, I think using this sort of approach, giving a few concrete real life people who might espouse views like this, is really the most helpful way to think about this issue. Whether you believe spirituality does or doesn't belong in the workplace is really, in many cases, going to come down to a sort of personal reflection, a personal approach, and also maybe even a collaborative approach. If you work in an organization that has a lot of religious people, or you work in an organization where it is not taboo to discuss spiritual issues like I do, maybe organizing things using spiritual language is appropriate. However, if you work in an organization where this is taboo, or maybe even disallowed, or maybe even harmful, depending on the context, then maybe taking something more like a Dillahunty, emotional scaffolding, logical uh, build up approach might be better. Um, Again, this is going to be affected a lot by your personal values, your organizational values, a whole host of other factors. But if you're going to use spirituality or you're not going to use spirituality, understanding the underpinning whereby you would use one or the other is probably the most critical